Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. I never thought I'd be the type of person to get into a war with a homeowners association, especially since I'm not even part of one, but here we are. And let me tell you, sometimes the best revenge is giving people exactly what they ask for. Some background about me first. I work as a civil engineer for the county, which means I know a thing or two about property law, zoning regulations, and how local government actually works. This knowledge would come in handy later, though I didn't know it at the time. My family has owned the same 20-acre piece of land for 3 generations now. My grandfather bought it back in the 1950s when it was just farmland outside of town. Over the years, the town grew around us, but we held on to our little piece of paradise. It's not really a working farm anymore, though we still call it that out of habit. My house sits on about 2 acres, and the remaining 18 acres get leased to a local farmer who cuts hay twice a year. This arrangement keeps our agricultural tax status, which saves us a decent chunk of money every year. The land itself is beautiful, I'll give you that. Rolling hills, a small creek running through the back portion, mature oak trees scattered throughout. It's the kind of place where you can sit on your porch in the morning with coffee and actually hear birds instead of traffic. My wife always jokes that we're living in a postcard, and she's not wrong. About 5 years ago, a developer bought the 80 acres adjacent to our property and built what they called the Summit. It's one of those luxury housing developments with names that sound fancier than they actually are. Big houses, perfectly manicured lawns, the works. Each house probably cost 3 times what ours is worth, which is fine by me. We've never been ones to keep up with the neighbors anyway. The development came with its own homeowners association, of course. Now, I want to be clear about something important here. Our property is not part of their HOA. Never has been, never will be. Our land predates their development by 70 years, and we have the deed to prove it. This fact becomes very important later. At first, having the new neighbors wasn't too bad. Sure, the construction noise was annoying for a couple of years, but that's temporary. Once families started moving in, things were pretty quiet. These weren't the type of people who threw loud parties or left their garbage cans out too long. If anything, they were almost aggressively normal. The problems started small. About 2 years after the development was finished, I found a note stuck to my mailbox. Not mailed to me, mind you, just tucked under the flag. It was printed on fancy letterhead with the HOA logo and everything. The note politely suggested that my agricultural outbuildings might be more appropriate if they were painted to complement the neighborhood aesthetic. They were talking about my tool shed and the small barn where I keep my tractor. Both buildings are well maintained and painted, just not in the beige and brown color scheme that apparently defines luxury living. I threw the note away and went about my business. My buildings are on my property, behind my house, barely visible from the road. If someone was offended by the sight of a red barn, that sounded like their problem, not mine. A few months later, another note appeared. This one expressed concern about noise ordinance violations during unsociable hours. After some investigation, I figured out they meant the farmer who cuts our hay. He typically starts early in the morning to beat the heat, usually around 6 a.m. Perfectly legal, and something that happens exactly twice a year for a total of maybe 8 hours. Again, I ignored it. The notes kept coming sporadically. Complaints about the gravel driveway looking rustic instead of paved. Suggestions that I might want to invest in professional landscaping for the front of my property. One particularly bold note even suggested I consider upgrading my mailbox to something more in keeping with the community standards. I'll admit the notes were annoying, but they were also completely toothless. The HOA had exactly 0 authority over my property, and I think whoever was writing them knew that. They felt more like someone hoping I'd just voluntarily comply, rather than any serious attempt at enforcement. The real trouble started this past spring. I came home from work on a Tuesday to find a thick envelope in my mailbox. Not a handwritten note this time, but a proper business envelope with a return address from a law firm. The kind of envelope that immediately makes your stomach drop a little. Inside was a certified letter on official legal letterhead, not from the HOA directly, but from their attorneys. The letter was 3 pages long and full of legal language that basically boiled down to this. The HOA claimed that my 18 acres of farmland had been erroneously excluded from their master development plan. According to their letter, when the original township plats were surveyed for the development, my farmland was supposedly earmarked as future community space. They claimed it was always intended to be part of their amenities package, complete with a clubhouse, swimming pool, tennis courts, and walking trails. The letter went on to say that this was obviously an oversight in the original paperwork, and they were prepared to resolve this matter quickly and amicably. Their proposed solution was to purchase my 18 acres for what they called a fair market price, which worked out to about 20% below what the land was actually worth. The whole thing was absurd on multiple levels. First, my family's deed to this land goes back to 1952. The HOA development was built in 2018. You don't need to be a civil engineer to understand that our property rights predate theirs by about 66 years. Second, the idea that my land was somehow erroneously excluded from their development plan was laughable. The developer would have had to survey around our property because we never sold it to them. You can't just accidentally include land you don't own in your development plans. But here's what really got me. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate attempt to steal my family's land by hoping I was either ignorant enough or intimidated enough to just go along with it. They were banking on the fact that most people see legal letterhead and panic. Unfortunately for them, they picked the wrong person to mess with. In my job, I deal with property law and municipal planning every single day. I knew exactly how rock solid my deed was, and I knew exactly how full of garbage their claims were. But I also knew something else. I knew that fighting this through the courts, even when you're obviously in the right, takes time and money. They probably figured that even if I didn't cave immediately, I'd eventually get tired of legal fees and just sell them the land to make it go away. That's when I decided to go to their next HOA meeting. These meetings are supposed to be open to the public, even for non-members, though I'd never bothered attending one before. I figured it was time to introduce myself properly and clear up their little misunderstanding. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse they'd built at the entrance to their development. Walking in there was like entering a different world. Everything was beige and chrome and glass, with abstract art on the walls that probably cost more than my truck. The kind of place where you're afraid to touch anything because it might be both expensive and fragile. About 30 people were there, mostly couples in their 40s and 50s. Everyone was dressed like they'd just come from church or a business meeting. I showed up straight from work in my boots and jeans, carrying my copy of their letter in a manila folder. The meeting was being run by a woman I'd never met before, though I'd seen her around the neighborhood. She was probably in her early 50s with perfectly styled hair and the kind of outfit that screamed, "I used to be important somewhere else." Everything about her body language suggested she was used to being the person in charge of whatever room she walked into. She introduced herself as the HOA president and launched into what was obviously a prepared speech about community standards and protecting property values. The whole presentation had the feel of something she'd given many times before. About 15 minutes into the meeting, during what she called new business, she brought up the topic of expanding community amenities. She talked about the need for more recreational facilities and how the association was exploring options for acquiring additional community space. That's when I stood up and introduced myself. I told them I lived on the property adjacent to their development and that I'd received their letter about my land. The president's whole demeanor changed the moment I mentioned the letter. Her business smile got a little tighter and she asked if I'd like to address the association about the matter. I kept it simple and direct. I explained that there seemed to be some confusion about property ownership and that my family's land was not, and never would be, part of their association. I mentioned that our deed predated their development by several decades and that any claims to our property were completely without merit. Her response was something to behold. Instead of backing down or apologizing for the misunderstanding, she doubled down. She started talking about community needs and how certain properties had always been intended for shared use. She mentioned that the original developer had always envisioned the area as one cohesive community space. The really galling part was how she framed it. She made it sound like I was being selfish by refusing to sell my family's land so they could build a pool. She talked about property values and community enhancement like I was somehow obligated to participate in their vision of what the neighborhood should look like. What really sealed the deal for me was the reaction from the other residents. Instead of being embarrassed by their president's obvious attempt at a land grab, they seemed to support it. Several people nodded along when she talked about community needs. One guy even asked if there was a timeline for when the new amenities would be completed. It became clear that this wasn't just one person going rogue. The entire association was on board with the idea of taking my land, whether through legal intimidation or actual legal action. They'd been promised a pool and tennis courts, and they didn't much care how they got them. I thanked them for their time and left the meeting, but I was furious. Not just angry about the attempted theft, but offended by the sheer arrogance of it all. These people had moved into their perfect little development 2 years ago, and now they wanted to expand it by taking land that had been in my family for 70 years. The situation escalated exactly 1 week later. I came home from work on a Thursday afternoon to find 2 men with surveying equipment walking around the edge of my hayfield, well inside my property line. I parked my truck and walked over to them. They were professional surveyors, just doing their job, so I kept things polite but firm. I introduced myself as the property owner and asked what they were doing on my land. They showed me their work order, which listed my parcel number and authorized a feasibility study for potential development. The work order was signed by the HOA president and paid for by the association. That's when I knew this had moved beyond aggressive letters and into actual trespassing. They weren't just talking about taking my land anymore. They were already treating it like they owned it. I took photos of everything, the surveying equipment, the work order, the men themselves. Then I politely but firmly told them they were on private property without permission and needed to leave immediately. After they packed up and left, I called the sheriff's department and filed a formal trespassing complaint. I had photographic evidence that the HOA had knowingly sent agents onto my property without permission. The deputy who took my statement was sympathetic and said he'd follow up with a formal warning to the HOA. That evening, my phone rang. It was the HOA president, and she was not happy about the trespassing complaint. She tried to frame the surveying as a routine property line verification and suggested I was being unreasonable by calling the sheriff. I let her talk for a few minutes, then calmly explained that sending people onto my property without permission was called trespassing regardless of what she wanted to call it. I told her that any further contact about my property should go through my attorney, and I hung up. But here's the thing. I didn't actually want to drag this through the courts for the next 2 years. Lawsuits are expensive and time-consuming, even when you're going to win. I wanted something faster and more permanent. I wanted these people to understand that actions have consequences, and I wanted those consequences to be highly visible and completely irreversible. That's when I started thinking about what they'd actually said they wanted. They claimed they wanted my land to be community space. They talked about shared use and community amenities. They wanted it to be available for everyone in the area to enjoy. So I decided to give them exactly what they asked for, just not in the way they expected. I spent the weekend researching the county's parks and recreation master plan. What I found was very interesting. The county had been looking for opportunities to expand public park space in our area, which had seen rapid development over the past decade. The problem was budget. Land acquisition costs were eating up most of their parks department funding, but they had a whole section in their plan about accepting donated land for public use. Apparently, it's not uncommon for property owners to donate land to the county for tax benefits and conservation purposes. I made some calls on Monday morning and set up a meeting with the county commissioner for that Friday. I told his office I was interested in discussing a potential land donation for public park use. The meeting went better than I could have hoped. The commissioner was genuinely excited about the possibility of adding new park space, especially in an area that was seeing so much new development. When I explained that I was prepared to donate 15 of my 18 acres immediately, he practically fell out of his chair. We talked about the logistics. The county would need to do their own survey and environmental assessment, but those could be fast-tracked if I was willing to pay for them up front. The legal paperwork would take a few weeks, but nothing complicated. Then I mentioned my conditions. The land had to be permanently zoned as public park space, meaning it could never be sold or developed privately. It had to be named after my family as the donors. And most importantly, they had to put up a large, permanent entrance sign that would be visible from the main road. The commissioner loved it all. Free land, expanded public recreation, and a feel-good story about local families supporting the community. He said he'd have the Parks Department director call me by the end of the week to start the process. Everything moved surprisingly quickly after that. The county survey was completed within 2 weeks. The environmental assessment took another week. The legal paperwork was finalized a month later. During this whole process, I didn't say anything to the HOA. Let them wonder why their harassment had suddenly stopped. Let them think maybe their intimidation tactics had worked and I was just quietly giving up. The first sign that something had changed was the large sign that went up at the entrance to their development on a Tuesday morning in early fall. Not on my property, mind you, but on the county right-of-way right next to the entrance to their fancy neighborhood. The sign was impossible to miss. 8 feet tall, professionally made, with the county logo prominently displayed. It read, "Coming soon, Family Freedom Park, a partnership with the County Parks Department." I made sure to be out in my yard that morning when people started leaving for work. The looks on their faces as they drove past that sign were absolutely priceless. Confusion, followed by recognition, followed by what I can only describe as dawning horror. My phone started ringing by lunchtime. First the HOA president, then several other board members. I let every call go to voicemail. They could figure out what had happened the same way everyone else would. The county moved fast on the development. Within 2 months, they'd installed a gravel parking lot right at the border of the HOA development. Public restrooms followed a month later. Then came the walking trails, which ran along what used to be the quiet backyards of several houses in the development. The final touch was the permanent entrance sign, 12 feet wide and 8 feet tall, made of carved stone with bronze lettering. Family Freedom Park, in letters big enough to read from the next county over. Below that, in smaller but still prominent text, donated by the family for the enjoyment of all citizens. The sign was positioned perfectly. Anyone entering or leaving the HOA development couldn't miss it. It was the first thing visitors saw when they came to look at houses for sale. It was the last thing residents saw when they left for work every morning. The park officially opened on a Saturday in spring, almost exactly 1 year after I'd received that first threatening letter from their lawyers. The county held a dedication ceremony, complete with a ribbon cutting and speeches from local officials. I was invited to speak at the ceremony, which gave me a chance to tell the story of how the park came to be. I kept it diplomatic, talking about the importance of preserving open space and making recreational opportunities available to all families in the area. What I didn't mention was the look on the HOA president's face when she realized what had happened, or the emergency HOA meeting that was called when residents found out their promised pool and tennis courts had turned into a public park with a parking lot in their backyard. The park was an immediate hit. On weekends, the parking lot fills up with families coming to use the walking trails and the fishing spots along the creek. Kids play in the open fields where the HOA had planned to put their exclusive clubhouse. Teenagers hang out by the creek where the tennis courts were supposed to go. The county even installed a small playground and some picnic tables funded by a state grant for rural recreation projects. What was supposed to be a private amenity for 30 families became a public resource for the entire community. As for me, I kept the 5 acres where my house sits, plus a small buffer around it. I still have my privacy and my family land. I just don't have to worry about aggressive neighbors trying to steal it anymore. The best part is watching the HOA residents deal with their new reality. The same people who nodded along when their president talked about taking my land for community use now complain constantly about having actual community use in their backyard. They've tried everything they can think of to get the park removed or relocated. Noise complaints to the county, which were dismissed because the park operates within normal hours. Petitions to the city council, which have no authority over county parkland. They even tried to get the state involved, claiming the park was somehow a public nuisance. Nothing has worked, of course. You can't sue the government for accepting a gift of land and turning it into a park. You can't complain about families using public recreation space that was specifically designed for public recreation. The HOA president resigned about 6 months after the park opened. Apparently, the stress of dealing with residents angry about the situation they'd created was too much for her. The new president is much more focused on actual community issues like snow removal and mailbox maintenance. Property values in the development have actually remained stable, despite all the dire predictions about the park ruining the neighborhood. Turns out most people see easy access to public recreation as a positive rather than a negative. But the real victory isn't financial or even legal. It's the principle of the thing. These people thought they could bully me into giving up my family's land because they wanted a fancier community center. Instead, they got exactly what they claimed they wanted, just shared with everyone else instead of kept exclusive to their little club. Every morning when I have my coffee on the porch, I can see families walking the trails where the HOA planned to build their private tennis courts. Kids fishing in the creek where they wanted to put their exclusive clubhouse. People from all over the county enjoying land that was almost stolen from my family and turned into another gated amenity. Sometimes I see former HOA board members using the park themselves, walking their dogs on the trails, bringing their grandkids to the playground. I wonder if they remember the meetings where they planned to take this land by force. I wonder if they understand the irony of enjoying the exact thing they tried to steal, just in a way that includes everyone instead of excluding most people. The story made local news when the park opened, though I kept the details about the HOA's attempted land grab out of the interviews. No need to embarrass people who'd already embarrassed themselves enough. But word gets around in small communities. Everyone knows why the park exists and how it came to be. The HOA development, which was once seen as the most desirable address in the area, is now known as the neighborhood next to the park that exists because they tried to steal their neighbor's farm. Real estate agents have started marketing houses in the development by emphasizing the proximity to public recreation rather than the exclusivity of the community. Walking distance to County Park sells better than exclusive gated community when everyone knows the gate failed to keep out the consequences of poor decisions. The county has been so happy with the success of the park that they've approached me about donating the remaining 3 acres of unused land around my house. I've told them I'll consider it when I'm older and don't need as much space. For now, I'm content to sit on my porch in the mornings and watch the sunrise over land that will be protected as public space forever. Land that my grandfather bought, my father maintained, and I saved from being turned into another exclusive amenity for people who already had more than enough. The HOA wanted community land. They got it. They wanted shared space. They got that too. They wanted recreational amenities that would benefit everyone in the area. Mission accomplished. They just forgot to specify that they wanted it to be private. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I work in contract security as an armed guard at a major utility company. I pick up extra work on my days off from my main site covering banks that the company I work for has as clients as well. Today, I covered a branch of a large bank that has a white and red logo like stagecoaches and traces their roots back to the mid-1800s. After I was allowed to enter the bank, the branch operations manager gave me a rundown and read me the riot act right off the bat. I had a feeling at that time that this might be a long day. 30 minutes later, a bank customer came in looking lost and said she had an appointment with a banker. I greeted her and told her to take a seat and they'll be with her shortly. That prompted Madame Baum to come out from the back and get on to me for telling the customer to take a seat. Told me that I wasn't allowed to give any direction to anyone coming in as it could cause problems. Okay, that's reasonable enough. An hour or so later, a man entered the branch with a problem and he was a bit irate because of his issue. Baum said she could try to help him and ran into issues, which caused him to get more irate, especially since she was not acting very helpful and kept putting the blame on him for something that appeared to be the bank's fault. She came out from behind the teller desk and was looking for a banker to help the gentleman, and while she was wandering around, I engaged him in conversation. He was wearing a Marine Corps hat and I started chatting with him about what he did in the Corps and other things along that line. She finally figured something out, and instead of calling the gentleman over, she called my name and did a throat slash. After she was finished with the gentleman and wasn't able to help him while still blaming him for the situation, she called me over and proceeded to lay into me about how we had just spoke about talking to people. She said that I'm here for presence only and I'm not here to de-escalate, one of the primary purposes of a security guard, or to speak with the clients. She said that my conversation with the man could cause problems for the bank, despite it not being about the bank at all, and that I wasn't to talk to the customers at all. I asked her if she wanted me to be seen and not heard, and she indicated that's what she wanted from me. She once again threatened to call my supervisor if I had a problem and didn't understand her. Message was received loud and clear. I notified my supervisor of the incident and then decided I was going to comply with her orders to the letter. Cue malicious compliance with me deciding to communicate for the rest of the day with signs from the limited sign language I know from my wife and friends, and gestures. People would ask me questions and I'd just gesture and point to please wait here sign. People would talk about the weather and I'd just nod. I directed people to stand in line with gestures and nods. This went on until just before noon when the branch manager pulled me into his office with Madame Baum. He proceeded to talk about their concerns and asked me what had happened with the irate gentleman. I filled him in, and it was obvious by his reaction that my version of events didn't match with what Madame Baum had told him. Nevertheless, he proceeded to tell me how I was supposed to do things and that we had to work together. According to the both of them, anything that I say, even not related to the bank or financial matters, can cause problems, and it's best to not say anything, especially to irate customers. Afterwards, as I was leaving his office, I informed him that I'd already let my supervisor know of the situation and that any further issues would be best brought to his attention. I'm half expecting them to call my supervisor to have me removed early, and that will be perfectly fine with me, as I never plan to cover this location in the future. I am eating lunch now, but I plan on continuing my malicious compliance after my break ends. I'll be present and do my rounds as I'm supposed to do, but nothing says that I have to greet people or discuss anything with anyone. End of day update. When speaking to my ops manager at the end of the day, he informed me that they requested that I not return to the branch because of how I responded to their request to not speak to the customers. Told him that was fine, as I was going to request to not go back to that branch anyways, and asked if I was getting wrote up. He said that I was in the clear, as it was obvious that I was following the client's instructions to the letter. I know it's probably not a very satisfying conclusion based on a lot of the stories here, but it's a good conclusion in the contract security world when following the client's instruction literally and engaging in malicious compliance. The next one is an entitled people story. I began work as a cooperative extension agent straight out of grad school and right before the pandemic started. For those unfamiliar, a cooperative extension agent is the public outreach branch of land-grant universities. Our primary responsibility is to connect homeowners and farmers with university research and encourage use of best practices that help the individuals meet their goals in the lowest impact way. Traditionally, extension was only for agriculture, but it now extends past its agriculture roots, and depending on the university in your state and the office in your specific county, topics can be anything, like financial literacy, family and consumer sciences, community development, mental health, etc. I was technically an agriculture agent, but I specialized in horticulture, which meant that I was dealing with trees, fruits, vegetables, lawns, gardens, and bugs. Unlike a lot of counties in my state, part of our district's daily operation was to make house calls, which was a huge blessing when you start your job in January 2020. Those excursions not only made it easier to answer questions, but they kept me from going stir-crazy during the pandemic. There was never a risk of spreading sickness either because all of my time was spent looking at sick plants outside and diagnostic questions like, what's wrong with my tree? Or, will my tree live? I would say that out of all of the questions I answered in my 4.5 years on the job, 3/4 of them were about trees. Those tree questions often came with additional risks that I had to outline to the landowner. If the tree ended up being a hazard and falling on something or someone, I wasn't strictly liable thanks to some laws in our state that protect educators acting in good faith, but my conscience would never let me live it down. Because of this, I always erred on the side of caution when it came to assessing a tree's hazard potential, and was very upfront with the individual on my estimation of a tree's risk and the steps they would need to take to keep the tree from becoming a greater risk. Most of the time the tree was manageable, but would take extra vigilance on the homeowner's part to make sure the problem did not get worse. If the tree was an immediate hazard, I recommended immediate removal. I was barely able to get comfortable with my job before I get acquainted with EP, and I had many interactions with her over my time as an extension agent. She would call me over the smallest question, and honestly, I loved answering them. My personality is one that thrives on mysteries and improvements, so her questions never bothered me. She lived in a small town and absolutely loved to garden. My visits to her house would last at least half an hour while she showed off her newest gardening experiments. When she had the opportunity, she participated in our volunteer training, Master Gardeners, and was at many of our volunteer events. All in all, she was one of my favorite repeat customers. That makes this specific story all the more confusing. Toward the end of my 3rd year on the job, the town she lived in experienced some violent straight-line winds that toppled about 2/3 of the city's tree canopy, including all but one of her trees, a gnarly silver maple at the end of her driveway. Just to put into perspective how much EP loved to garden, I am convinced that she went through an actual grieving process when the rest of her trees were felled. Initially, she asked me out to confirm that the silver maple left standing was not a hazard, and there were no indications that it was. I told her as much, and that was that, for the moment anyway. 2 weeks later, I get another call from EP. This time she sounds agitated. OP, someone from the city who was here to clean up the tree debris backed their truck into my tree and took a chunk out of the trunk. Can you come take another look at it? No problem. I get to the tree and there is a sizable gash of the bark and underlying wood. The city truck really did a number on it. No kidding. I went up to observe the wood under the bark, and while it looked nasty, there were still no indications that it was a hazard. Do you think it will live? The trunk didn't damage most of the underlying wood, so I think that as long as you monitor it for decay, it should pull through. I didn't go into my usual level of detail because of her experience and training, which ended up being a mistake. 2 weeks after that conversation, I got a call from her again, and I don't remember the exact details about why she called, but the increasingly maligned silver maple got brought up again. As long as you monitor it to make sure decay doesn't enter the underlying wood, it will be okay. For the rest of its life? I squinted. Yes. You didn't say that when you came to look at it. I squinted again. I didn't think I needed to, with her experience and training. EP, once the wood in the trunk is exposed, the tree will do its best to heal the wound, but decay will get in there eventually. The tree still has plenty of life left in it, and it's no hazard to your house. Her tone changed immediately. So, I have to spend time checking on this tree when I could have gotten reimbursement from the city for damaging it? I thought I had made this clear during the second visit. I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear, but yes, that pretty much sums it up. Then came the zinger. Well, next time I guess I'll call an expert. Click. I was stunned for a couple of reasons. First, our house calls are completely free. Getting a tree expert out to her small town to look at the tree and give her the testimony she would need to get reimbursed by the city would have been prohibitively expensive, eaten up any money she would have gotten from the city, and likely would have resulted in a removal recommendation, which would mean additional costs. We were in the poorest part of our state, so I always tried to keep trees around when I could and had to balance costs against risks. Second, between my undergraduate degree and employment at landscaping companies, parks, and rec departments, I had maybe 8 years of horticulture experience, and I'm pretty sure she still had me beat, so she should have understood what the injury to the tree meant for management. And lastly, there were the positive interactions I had with her previously, which did not prepare me at all for this bizarre 180. I sulked the rest of the day. I'm a stewer, not a spewer. But was back to normal the next day and just let it roll off me. I chalked it up to agitation from potentially losing another tree. The real kicker of this story is that up until I left the job to return to school, I interacted with EP at least 10 more times, and they were all like my first experiences with her, polite, even pleasant. She never brought up that one phone call, and neither did I. No reason to kick the hornet's nest. I'm pretty sure she just left the tree as is and didn't raise a stink about it, and to my knowledge the tree is still standing, one of the healthiest, strongest silver maples, which isn't saying much. It was the most sour experience I had in the job, and all things considered, if that was the worst experience in 4.5 years, I was pretty lucky. It did give me one important lesson that I will take with me for the rest of my life. When money is involved, people get weird, so be ready for people you think you know to act in completely unexpected ways once money enters the picture. Anyway, thank you for watching.